Alright guys, let's get started with today's topic. So today we're going to look at some more to do with Active Directory. We're going to look at some Active Directory domain services, and we're going to have a look at some of the operation masters. Okay, in 5ICW we briefly talked about how there's certain tasks that only one of the domain controllers should do. Okay, and we call these things operation masters, and we'll explore these operation masters a little bit more today. And in the practical, we'll work out how to transfer these operation masters from one domain controller to another domain controller. So today what we're gonna try to do is actually talk about virtualizing domain controllers. Obviously, we've been doing that in our class already. But what if you were doing this in a production environment, not just a practice environment? Okay, so we could have run into potential problems, and basically we'll talk about how in Windows 2016 server it can mitigate those problems. We'll talk about the RODCs, or read-only domain controllers, where we should have them, what's the difference between a RODC and a regular DC, and so where to apply them. And also we'll talk about the Active Directory database. So a bit more about Active Directory. So first of all, just a bit of a review on Active Directory if you forgot from ICW. So here's some components. So a Active Directory domain service is composed of physical and logical components. So physical components are the things you can actually touch. Okay, the physical computers, the physical servers. So, and also the logical components are the components that are in the Active Directory where there's no physical presence, but they actually exist to actually perform some functions. Like, for example, we have partitions, we have schemas, we have domains, we have domain trees, forests, sites, and OUs. They are all logical components that actually allow us to structure our Active Directory tree, not in real life, not in the physical world, but in the virtual world or in the computer world. Okay, so if you look at this diagram, you might have seen this from previous class, but here's an example of an Active Directory forest. Okay, you notice that there's actually two. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Sorry guys, I'm too worried about the recording. I forgot the actual projector. Alright. So if you look at this diagram, you can see there's actually a Active Directory forest, and there's actually two trees. Okay, so it's got that image of crosser, but once that actually goes, you'll be able to see it. So in this case, you've got two trees. You've got a forest root. In this case, this datum.com is the forest root. It's the root of the whole forest. And you've got this fabricam.com, which is actually tree root. So if you remember back into the 5ICW, we spoke about how we can, in Active Directory, we can have a tree. If we look at this particular tree, the datum tree, there's actually a subdomain, alt.datum.com. They're interrelated because you can see that there's actually sharing the same namespace. Okay, it's sharing the same namespace, and this is a child domain of this datum.com. This Fabricam doesn't share the same namespace. Okay, so it's a totally different namespace, but it exists in the same forest. And if you look at these arrows, what these arrows are inferring is a trust. Okay, in this case, the arrows go in two ways, so it's a two-way trust. So when you're in the same tree, sharing the same namespace in your child domain, by default you have this two-way trust. Okay, when you have different trees, or in the forest, you can configure this two-way trust. And what does this trust mean? It means that if I was a user in the fabricam.com and there was a resource here in the datum.com and I needed to access it, because of this two-way trust, I don't need to create a user account in this domain or this tree. I can keep my user account here, but you know how we were using global groups and universal groups, or global groups for us in 5ICW? if I belong to some sort of global group, let's say lecturers, those global groups from this fabricum.com can be actually used in this old datum.com to be placed in a domain local group and given access to this resource. Okay, so when I log in, I still authenticate against the Active Directory here, but I am able to go through and access this resource, and the server which is hosting this resource can confirm my identity, confirm my authorization to access that by using these trusts to eventually gain my identity. So Active Directory, as we know, requires servers called domain controllers. Okay, domain controllers are the servers which actually have Active Directory installed onto them. Okay, they actually contain the Active Directory database, and the domain controllers are the ones who actually process our logins. So when you guys came in today, logged into your computers, you actually sent your authentication information to the Active Directory domain controllers. So we can have more than one domain controller, and Microsoft always recommends that you have at least 2 domain controllers for any size network. Even if it's a small size network, you should have 2. Because it's so important. Because think about it: if you only had one domain controller and it was offline today, you guys walk in, you want to log in, you enter your username, password, you enter, but if the domain controller is dead, you won't be able to log in. Okay, you won't be able to access your computer. You won't be able to do any work at all. And what's worse, even if you can log into the local computer or the local computer, you couldn't access any of the resources that requires this authorization. Okay, so even if you can access your local computer, you may not be able to access the network resources. So all domain controllers hold a copy of the domain database. Okay, so don't forget, Active Directory is a database. It's a read optimized database, meaning that it's faster, more efficient to read from it than to write to it. It is where your user accounts and group accounts are all stored, as we all know from ICW. And when we make a change to Active Directory, we make a change on a domain controller. But when we make a change on a domain controller, that domain controller triggers a replication. It becomes what's called the master replicator, and it actually sends that change to all the other domain controllers that's in the domain. So the domain, as we know, is represented by this triangle shape. Is the context within which users and groups and computers are created. So we create computer accounts, server accounts, group accounts, user accounts, and we've used that already in 5ICW. So this is a bit of a review. The domain is also a replication boundary. What does that mean? It means that if we've got multiple domain controllers in this domain, the replication occurs to all of those. But if we had a tree, for example, like this, where we had multiple domains, if we were here, the replication would only occur between the domain controllers within this domain, not between the domain controllers of the different domains, even though they're related. Okay, so that's what we're saying, where replication is the domain is a replication boundary. It's an intra-domain replication. The domain is an administrative center for configuring and managing objects. Okay, so we call everything that's in Active Directory an object. It's a centralized management, so it's one place where we could create accounts for everyone. We don't have to create it on the Wi-Fi, on the email, on your individual computers, on Learn. We create an Active Directory, and all these services, which are LDAP compliant, can actually access it and use it as an authentication source. Any domain controller can authenticate logons in the domain. So if you're a domain controller, regardless of whether you are a read-only domain controller, the third domain controller, or another domain controller, you can authenticate people's logins. Okay, so obviously, if one's not available, the other one can still authenticate your logins. So extending Active Directory into the Microsoft Azure. So we spoke about this last term as well, so this is a bit of a review. So have you ever wondered, if you had an application, have you ever actually played a game or used a site where you needed to log in? Okay, have you guys used the site or application that needed you to authenticate, log in? Yeah, so you have. Yeah, so Facebook, like, Candy Crush, I'm sure like there's heaps of games, Pokemon Go, all those games, all those things, even though they might not, you don't think they're business orientated or anything like that, they require you to log in, don't they? So basically, when we have Active Directory, we can have, when we want to put it into the cloud, we could actually have two types of Active Directory. We could have an Active Directory cloud only deployment. What does that mean? That means that this Active Directory and your Active Directory on your company, in your company, on your premises is not linked together. Okay, this could be a place where you have, anyone can sign up for an account. Okay, they sign up for an account, and then you can use this to authenticate applications that you might host in the cloud. Applications like your Candy Crush, like your Flappy Bird, like your Pokemon Go. If they're hosted in the cloud, they can authenticate against this Active Directory, Azure Active Directory. You can also, obviously use some of the other services. For example, we'll know about Office 365. Okay, so as part of being students in TAFE SA here, you guys have Office 365. You are using our TAFE SA's subscription. What does that mean? That basically means that you can access Outlook online, you can use your documents online, and you can also download and install Office onto your computers, two of your devices yourselves. Okay, so but if you notice that every time you actually sign in or use one of those applications, it asks you for your sign-in details to OneDrive, to Skype for Business, to Office. All that again can be hosted in an Active Directory in the cloud. Okay, so a cloud-only deployment allows us to have a new forest in the cloud, and this can be used to support applications in the cloud like your Flappy Bird, like your Candy Crush and so forth, as well as more serious applications like Office 365. You can run applications and Active Directory in isolation from your corporate directory. So basically, by having a cloud only, it's separate from your corporate Active Directory. They're not linked at all. Okay, and these are used mainly to support extranet applications. We can also have a hybrid deployment, okay, which basically allows us to go to the cloud and extend our Active Directory into the cloud and do exactly what we were talking about just before. But instead of just being cloud only and not linked to your corporate directory service, it's actually a hybrid, meaning that it actually links back to your corporate Active Directory. Okay, so it supports corporate applications in the cloud. So that's exactly how TAFE SA actually does it. It supports your user account, your single sign-on. So you can go to Office 365. You can access use it for Learn, which is actually hosted on a Azure platform. It supports business-to-business authentication by using Active Directory Federation services. It supports high availability and disaster recovery scenarios. What does that mean? That means like if your site, your corporate location is actually wiped out, it's gone, fire, flood, whatever. Well, you've sort of got a copy in the cloud still, haven't you? So therefore, even if you have nothing, you can still rebuild a new office, a new servers, and almost replicate all the details back from the cloud. Okay. So let's keep on going. So we've already been doing this. Okay, we've been doing this in class quite a lot. Okay, we've been virtualizing our servers. Okay, not a big deal. We're doing this as a learning tool. Okay, but obviously virtualization is used more than just for practice, for testing. Okay, that's one of the areas that you can use virtualization for. But really, these days, virtualization mainly is used for the enterprise, meaning instead of having physical servers on your premises or in your company, you have physical servers which then host all sorts of virtual machines that run on them. Okay, so we spoke about this in full IVM, and you obviously should know about the advantages of server consolidation, saving capital expenditure and so forth, sustainability as well. But the benefits of virtualization for a server is that it's very scalable. Okay, what does that mean? It means that if I need a new server for a web server, I don't need to actually try to fit it on a physical machine which has got our server 2016, and we could say, hey, this server 2016 can be domain controller plus web server. Well, that's sort of not ideal. So if we needed a web server these days, because we can virtualize, we can just keep the domain controller as a separate machine. We just throw up a virtual machine and make it into a web server. Okay. And you know what? If we don't get the sizing correct, as in we didn't give enough RAM, we didn't give enough CPU cores, we didn't give it enough virtual hard drive space. The beauty of virtualization is we can adjust that very easily. We don't have to source a new server, upgrade components. We just change the settings on a virtual machine. And you know what? If we needed to throw up more servers, we can just continually create a new virtual machine, and just add more hosts. Okay, so if you continue to study with us into the diploma, you'll do a subject called 5ISV, and we'll learn a lot more about enterprise virtualization in that subject. We'll talk about Hyper-V in more depth. The other thing is it's independent from hardware, meaning, hey, if it's running on this piece of hardware today, but this piece of hardware needs the power supply to be replaced because it's about to fail, I could just quickly transfer this virtual machine from this piece of hardware to another piece of hardware. Okay, in Hyper-V, that's called live migration. In VMware vSphere, it's called vMotion. Okay, so that's really quick and easy. Okay, so your services continue to run even though your hardware is being fixed up or broken or whatever the reason is. It's also quick recovery, so we all know about how virtual machines is just a bunch of files, right? We can actually just copy those files. We even know that in virtual machines we can have what's called checkpoints or snapshots. Okay, and if you remember, they're point-in-time backups of our virtual machine, and I'm sure when you were doing your assignments, you probably used those snapshots quite a bit, because if you took a snapshot, you did something, made a mistake, I'll just revert to that snapshot. Okay, that's really great for us studying in the class. So Server 2012 as well as 2016 is cloud ready and virtualization aware, which means it knows it's been virtualized. It's probably more likely to be virtualized than be physical these days, okay? But some of the things you need to consider when you do virtualize in a production environment, okay? So when we do it, we're sort of doing it in a practice environment. We really don't care if we just roll back the snapshot from here to here, because it's not really affecting any real users. It's not really affecting any other systems. Our systems are sort of self-contained. But just imagine you had a production domain controller, okay, which is one server of maybe 10 domain controllers in a real live network. You realize you've installed a driver and it's actually totally stuffed up this virtual machine, or installed a program and it's totally stuffed up this virtual machine. It doesn't work anymore. It doesn't boot anymore. Well, easiest way is I revert back to a snapshot, isn't it? Okay, revert back to a snapshot. That's what we would do. But but the problem is with a production machine, when I'm reverting back this one machine back to a snapshot, I'm not going to revert every machine on the whole network back to the same snapshot. I'm probably didn't take those snapshots, and secondly, that would be too much of a disruption. So if I roll back this domain controller from this point, which is the broken point, back to a snapshot, that's fine. They'll fix the problem. But now what? Now it's actually out of sync with every other domain controller. You get me, guys? It's out of sync with every other domain controller. What does that mean? Okay, potentially you could have really, really damaging problems. For example, we'll talk about the RID later on. But if you remember, every object that gets created in Active Directory has what's called a SID, a security identifier. Okay? So the domain controller creates these SIDs or unique SIDs by actually using a RID, a relative ID. This RID is in a RID pool. It's a pool of RIDs. So it's basically you got 6,000 RIDs to use maybe today, or this time. When you need more, you get more. But you've got 6,000 RIDs. Okay, they're just numbers. So if I was the domain controller and I created 100 users, I would use 100 of those numbers, wouldn't I? Okay, so I've done that, and I've created those users. Those users get replicated across the across the Active Directory domain to all the other domain controllers. That's what we know it happens, right? But now suddenly there's a problem on me, the domain controller, and I have to go back in time. Basically, going back to snapshot is going back in time. I've gone back 10 days to before when these 100 users were created. You get me, guys? So now I don't know about these 100 users, and also my RID pool, suddenly I didn't use 100 of those RID numbers. Now I can use it again, can't I? If I was allowed to come back straight up, be turned on, be part of the network, and be trusted and all that kind of stuff, well, what's to say that if I create another user now that I might use the same RID that I previously used for the other 100 users? Whoa, what does that mean? That means if I use the same RID to create this new user, it could have a exact same SID as one of the other users I've created previously. Okay, think about you guys. If you guys had the same student ID as someone else in the system, that would be impossible to work, wouldn't it? And it will cause untold security problems. So basically, you'll find, especially when we do our assignment, when we start doing our assignment, because we've got so many servers and multiple domain controllers and so forth, you'll find that if you actually snapshot your virtual machines at different stages and you revert one back to one point back in time and not the others, you'll have errors creep in to say that the trust relationship between these two virtual machines has been lost or something like that. Have you ever guys got any error messages like that? The trust relationship between these the computers has been lost. Okay, you'll find that's what kind of error message you'll have if you revert one virtual machine back to a snapshot and not the rest. Okay, in our worksheets, in our assignment, what I'll ask you to do is that we actually take snapshots of all the virtual machines exactly the same time. Okay. Then if we need to revert back, we revert all of the virtual machines back to that same point, a snapshot, so we don't have that problem. Okay, it's not a huge problem if these two computers are not both domain controllers. If it's just a regular server, if you have that issue of it's lost the trust relationship, you could just take it out of the domain, rejoin it to the domain, and that's fine. The problem is when they are domain controllers. So when you do virtualize computers in the production world, in real life, in the enterprise, you have to make sure of time synchronization. Well, you're probably going, what? Time synchronization? Why is that such a big deal? Well, you know, for everything like cryptography, for access control and stuff like that, it's based on time. Okay? And if your time between one computer and another computer are off, then you'll find that those things don't work properly. You'll have all sorts of errors there. A lot of times those errors don't even make sense. So basically, by default in a domain, all the domain computers, like the ones in front of you, synchronize their time from the domain controller. And obviously, our domain controllers usually synchronize with a time server on the internet. But if they're a virtual machine, what happens is that they synchronize their time with the actual physical host. Have you noticed that? So your virtual machine's time is always relative to your physical machine's time. Okay, if you change the time zone to be Victorian time zone, for example, you'll be exactly half an hour off from your host machine, which is in Adelaide. Okay, so that's what virtual machine does. So basically, if you're virtualizing your computers, maybe don't use the host synchronization. Make sure you're synchronizing the time to an external time source using the NTP, Network Time Protocol. Domain membership of a virtualization host. Obviously, once we're in a domain, there's a trust, like I mentioned before. There's a trust between all the members of the domain to actually be able to control access and authorize access and so forth. So therefore, if we actually are going back in time and time traveling effectively with snapshots, it's almost like someone's impersonating. Can I get you to grab the door? Someone's impersonating this server from a time before, so they lose that time. Yeah, come on in. They lose their trust. You also have to be careful that if you are virtualizing, that if you only have one physical computer with all these virtual machines running on it, there's a single point of failure. So even though we're talking about how we can consolidate hardware and so forth, we should always have multiple virtualization hosts.
I'm not saying that you should have as many hosts as the servers you have, but you should have multiple hosts that if one actually fails, it's not all your servers that fail. You can actually use live migration, vMotion, high availability, and and virtual machine replication to actually be able to switch to another physical machine and still run the service. Okay. Also, there's a consideration of moving Active Directory to the cloud. So we spoke about that just before in the previous slide. So if you're going to virtualize, we can do that as well. So let's actually look at how checkpoints or snapshots. So I tried to describe what happened just then. Okay. So let's actually look at it from a sort of visual point of view. So if we have two domain controllers, domain controller 1, domain controller 2, they're working, happy. Okay, everything's replicating and so forth. So now we have data, which is different. Obviously, data with differences between the domain controllers, and as you expect, they replicate that data. Okay, so therefore the data is replicated and it's consistent. So now we take a snapshot. When we take a snapshot or a checkpoint, that data at that point in time is frozen. Okay, if you didn't realize that, your hard drive at that point in time is not frozen, as in it's not changed anymore. Then you spawn off another virtual hard drive, which actually has the changes between that checkpoint or snapshot and what you've been doing. Okay, so you make more changes, and they replicate. No problems. So just before that step, no problems. Everything's working fine. These checkpoints are fine, and you're replicating. But then you discover that domain controller 2 has a big problem. Okay, it's failing because something you've done. And so you say, hey, what's a quick way to recover this server? I can just go back in time. I can go back in time and use my checkpoints. And so you actually revert that back in time. But then the data that's on this hard drive and the data which is on this hard drive, which is on the other domain controller, are different. And that's where you can cause serious problems. So snapshots is not recommended for production virtual machines. Okay, so it's great for us in the classroom as for testing, but snapshots is not recommended for production virtual machines. But having said that, in the Server 2016 Hyper-V, they've actually addressed this a little bit, or quite a bit, and it's a little bit more safer because now they have what's called virtual machine generations, okay, which helps identify it. So we'll talk about it in a second. So to support safe virtualization of domain controllers, the hypervisor needs to support virtual machine generation identifiers. So they need to know which generation this virtual machine is. So such as Hyper-V on Server 2012 and in 2016 even better, the virtual guest domain controller needs to also be Server 2012 or 16 in our case. So what happens? What safeguards? So basically, like I said, if you don't have these safeguards, you'll have a different information in Active Directory between one that's not been gone back to a snapshot and that one that has gone back to a snapshot. Okay, that's where it causes the problems. So, so the safeguards are triggered when a snapshot is triggered during a guest shutdown. A snapshot is restored when the virtual machine is running. And basically the guest, when I say guest, is basically saying the virtual machine, okay? Employs a virtualization safeguards by, you know how we talked about the RID pool just before? So if I was a domain controller and I went back in time for a snapshot, okay, I went back in time for a snapshot. These safeguards say that, hey, the first thing I'll do is I'll invalidate my local RID pool, which means it doesn't matter if I've got still 1,000 RIDs or 6,000 RIDs to use in my RID pool, I'll just throw it away. That prevents any chance of actually reusing the same RID again, causing that conflict that we were discussing. Okay. Secondly, we will set a new invocation ID for me, which is I'm the domain controller who's gone back in time for a snapshot. And basically, what does that mean? That means actually anything I know is rubbish. That's basically what it's saying. and I will now get all my information from the other domain controllers who are still online. Okay, you get what I'm saying? You're saying that basically throw away your RID pool. You don't need that anymore because that could be potentially dangerously wrong. And with the information you do know is wrong. So wipe your database and recreate that database by replicating from the other domain controllers. So basically, it's possible to snapshot and it's possible to use snapshot, but in a lot of ways, it can cause problems in a production world more so as well. Even though there's benefits, there's also potential problems. So like I said, there's been improvements so that you can do this easily, but still my general personal feeling is that you should not use snapshots as your form of backup for in a production world. Okay, so don't forget you've got your regular backups to back up the data. Okay, you've got your imaging, and also you can back up this what's the system state to back up some of the settings, including Active Directory. So what about domain controller cloning? Okay, generally, again, this is one of the things that's like in virtual machines, like in physical machines, you can do it, but it's not as easy. But in a virtual machine, it's very easy to clone a virtual machine. We've all done that, haven't we? But in a domain controller, so we've done that. When we actually created some of those virtual machines for our 5ICW, I assume that you guys created by cloning. Is that correct? Maybe? Or you build it all from scratch, but for this subject, we'll create all our servers for cloning. But again, the problem with a clone, or let's talk about the benefits actually. The benefits of a clone is that it's a rapid deployment. You got one virtual machine, you want another one just like it, you got another one. Pretty quick and easy. Very quick and easy. Okay, it's good for actually for testing something. Like I've got this thing I want to test, but I don't really want to test it on this production virtual machine. I'll make a clone and I'll test it here. Very good. It's good for recovery strategies because that means that if this is broken or something like that, I can create a clone from and get another one. So when we do clone a Windows computer, and when it's by itself, no big deal. If it's not meant to be on a network, no big deal. If it's not meant to be in a domain, no big deal. But if it's meant to be in a domain, then we've got some potential problems again. So remember we talked about the SID, okay, the security identifier. So every computer has a unique SID. Okay, my computer and your computer in front of you right now, even though they might appear identical, same operating system, same software, same everything, they would have a different security identifier. So when we actually make a clone from original to a copy, guess what? The security ID or SID is still identical. And if we try to turn both of them on into the same domain, you'll have a conflict. Okay? So basically when we do cloning, and we'll show you next week, if you haven't already done it, what we'll do is that we will, in the class, we will create a golden master, take a snapshot, and then we'll create a golden master, we'll run a sysprep, system preparation tool, and then create a snapshot. So therefore that system preparation tool will actually change the SID of any of the computer you're sitting on. Okay, it will change the SID. So when we deploy any clones from this golden master, it will have a different SID. Okay. So but the problem is we can't run sysprep on a domain controller, or we couldn't. Okay. So basically, once it's a domain controller, you can't clone it anymore. Okay, in the past, you can clone it, but to be honest, I wouldn't want to do it this way. It's probably it gives you more trouble and it's more effort than it's actually worth most times. Okay, so in order to clone a domain controller, but given that we just spoke about all the problems of cloning a domain controller, we need to add the domain controller into. So this is a production domain controller as well. So it's even worse. You need to add the domain controller into a clonable domain controllers group. First of all, you need to verify the application and services are compatible. You need to create a DC clone config XML file, and you need to export once and create as many clones as you need to and start the clones. Okay, So it is possible to clone a domain controller, but again, my recommendation is you don't clone a domain controller. In our assignment, it's easy enough to just create a base Server 2016 virtual machine, do the sysprep on it, and create all these other base 2016 virtual machines, and then make it into the domain controller if you need to. So this is just a situation of what if I really want to clone this domain controller and really need to for another reason, okay? Not for our reasons that we would use in class. This is a production domain controller. So domain controller virtualization best practice, avoid single points of failure. So I can give you an example of this. If you remember how we said we should have multiple domain controllers on a network of any size. Well, what if we had 10 domain controllers, but they were all virtualized and they were all hosted on the same physical machine? Does that sound like a problem to you? Yeah, so if this virtual machine has a problem, if someone accidentally kicks the network cable out of this virtual machine, this physical machine, if someone actually the power supply goes or something like that, something silly goes like that, all of my domain controller, which is actually sitting as virtual machines on this, will go offline. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about with a single point of failure. So obviously, what we're saying is, in a virtualized environment, you should have many physical hosts, not as many as you would if you were completely physical, but you will have many physical hosts and you will spread your domain controllers across them rather than putting all on one. And obviously we can use live migration or vMotion VMware to actually move these virtual machines around to the right configuration we want. Okay. In fact, we can also set up affinity rules or anti-affinity rules so that these virtual machines are never on the same host. Okay. So we can talk about more about that when we do the virtualization subject. So if you're going to do that, I think next term, you'll be doing it with me anyway, okay? Ensure that all computers participate in the same time service. Like I said, they need to be the same time synchronization. So if one's synchronizing with the host and one's synchronizing with the YAL time server, they might have different times and they might cause problems, okay? Use virtualization technology with virtual machine generation identifiers. So this allows us to use snapshots in production. But like I said, I don't personally recommend it. I personally rather use, I would use snapshots, but I wouldn't use it as the only way to restore my systems. Maybe as a last resort, but I would use my regular backups to back up my data and information. Use Server 2012 or 16 as virtualization guests. Avoid or disable snapshots. So even though it says, hey, use this virtual machine identifier, it says here, avoid or disable snapshots. Okay, so generally I would avoid it. Ensure that the virtualization administrator is as trusted as your domain administrator. So sometimes you could have a domain administrator, which is administrator for everything, but then you can also have a virtualization administrator, which is someone who's only in control of the virtualization infrastructure. But to be honest, that's a pretty important infrastructure these days. So therefore, you should probably have the same level of trust for both. Consider taking advantage of cloning in your deployment or recovery strategies, but just understand what the potential problems are. So like I said, if you're going to use cloning for testing and they're separate from your actual production network, no problems at all. Okay. Don't start more than 10 clones at a time. Okay, so that's a pretty big number. Consider using virtualization technology that allows virtual machines guests to move between sites. So that's replication. Okay, we'll learn more about that in 5ISV. Adjust your naming strategy to allow domain controller clones. And if you haven't already noticed that I've sort of trying to be steering you down a track of actually naming your virtual machines correctly. Okay, so for this assignment that we're going to do in this subject, you've been given names for those servers, okay, specifically, with some variation for your names and so forth. And obviously, it's just like if you're in the workplace. If your boss says, hey, these are the servers I want you to build, this is their names, you know, if you give them something that says, you build a server, but instead of naming it, you know, RODC, you know, ADL1, you call it Bob.
just doesn't fit the company policy, does it? So especially when we're virtualizing, okay, so you know that we can actually create a virtual machine. It has a name. When we actually install the operating system, we give it a name inside as well, right? If this one's called Bob and this one's called RODC Adelaide 01, it can get a little bit confusing, which is what. So generally, the best practice is that wherever you name this machine in the operating system is what you should name the virtual machine in the actual virtualization environment. Okay, so they both should match up. So when I'm talking about the RODC ADL01, you can easily find the virtual machine. You could easily find the operating system on the network. Okay. So let's talk about RODCs. So we sort of mentioned RODCs. RODCs are read-only domain controllers. Just like the name says, it's a read-only copy. So you cannot make changes on this domain controller. Remember how we said we can make changes on any domain controller and they replicate to all the other domain controllers? Yes, except for RODCs, except for read-only domain controllers. Okay, so the read-only domain controller has what's called credential caching, administrative role separation, and read-only DNS. What the hell does that mean? What it really means is that the read-only domain controller has your user accounts, knows it connects to the domain, but it doesn't have a copy of your passwords on the local system. Okay, think about it. Okay, so why do we need a RODC? RODC, read-only domain controller, is used in a situation where the environment's not trusted. Okay, think about it. So if you go to a public library, yeah, you guys all been to a public library recently? There's plenty of computers around, isn't it? So anyone can walk in, anyone can get a membership, anyone can access the computers, anyone could be doing anything on those computers potentially. So that would be a situation where I don't trust that environment. If I place a regular domain controller in that environment and it's being authenticating all those computers in that environment and they deal with this regular domain controller, well, there's a potential that someone could potentially hack this domain controller. Okay, what does that mean? Because anyone could walk into that library, they could potentially be running their laptops, their own computers as well, and they could be potentially attacking this domain controller. If this was a regular domain controller, once they've fully, let's assume the worst, if they've compromised this computer, they could then potentially copy the password information from this domain controller, even though it's encrypted and all scrambled and whatever, somewhere, and they could run some sort of rainbow hash attack or auth attack against it and sort of get your password information for all your users. Secondly, if I can make changes, why can't I just reset the password? Hey, couldn't I just reset the administrator password? Well, if it was a regular domain controller, I could. But if it was a read-only domain controller, I can't make changes. So first of all, the password files are not stored on the read-only domain controller. And secondly, you cannot make changes to the Active Directory from a read-only domain controller. So to deploy our RODC, ensure there is no computer account for the domain Active Directory domain services for the new RODC computer. Pre-create an account on the Active Directory in the domain controllers container and run the Active Directory installation wizard on the new RODC. And we'll sort of do this in our worksheet, so you'll become more obvious. Sometimes when you're describing in words how a practical procedure goes, it's sort of, it doesn't seem, like you can't remember it too well. But when you're actually doing it, you'll see it. So basically, the RODC can authenticate users, so all those people in the library can still log in and send their authentication details to the RODC. You're probably going to ask, how do they authenticate if they don't have a copy of their passwords on locally? Okay, first of all, there's if this is the RODC here, and I'm sending authentication information to this RODC in this environment, this RODC still has a network connection to the regular domain. So it actually, when someone's authenticating, it actually fetches the password information for that user from a regular domain controller and actually authenticates them in. Okay? The term credential caching means that
once you've actually logged in once, your credentials are cached there.
Cache means temporary storage, right?
So stay there for a bit and it will get wiped out eventually.
But what we can do is we can say, hey, what if there's a cut in the network or outage in the network between the RODC and the regular domain controller?
Well, it can't authenticate anyone, can it?
Well, that's a problem.
So what if there's some people that really needs to get on in a situation like that?
We can decide for this, if we're talking about a library, we can say the librarians group will have their credentials pre-cached or cached locally. What does that mean? That means that instead of actually storing just their credentials temporarily, their credentials for this group of librarians in that area will always be on the RODC and they can always log in. Okay, even though the users can't, the
librarians can. And obviously you should never cache the domain administrator's credentials.
All right, so credential caching is managed through a password replication policy. So the password replication policy determines which credentials to cache on the RODC, user accounts or computer accounts. So there's both. Okay, besides the user's credentials, there's computer credentials as well. Determine it contains an allow and deny list. So there's a allow RODC password replication group and a denied password replication group. Basically, the administrator will always be in the denied password replication group because we don't want people to somehow get hold of the administrator's password. So like it says, do not cache the domain administrative account. Managing local administration for RODCs. We can delegate read-only domain controller administration to a local administrators. So delegate is to give permissions to. Okay. Set up a single security principal as an administrator, a user, or group. Enable by using the following methods. We can manage. Use the Managed By tab of the RODC, or we can use the dsmgmt command or the ntdsutils command, and we can cache the credentials of the delegated administrator. So if you don't understand what we just spoke about, what we're speaking about, well, if the credentials of the administrator is never cached, what if there is an outage? If there is an outage, so before there is an outage, what we do is we create what's called a local administrator, a user. Okay, we make him a local administrator, and then on this tab of the RODC object in Active Directory, we can actually set this person, this account that we spoke about, or this group, as the ones managing the RODC. Okay, so in the case there's an outage between the RODC and the regular domain controllers, this credentials will be cached, and then you still can log in as this administrative account locally. So we won't go through that because that's what we're going to do in our practical, and we'll keep on going. So some of the things we can use for Active Directory administration include, Active Directory administration snap-ins includes 4 different MMC consoles. Okay, so they're Microsoft Management Consoles. So I'm sure you've seen this already. Like, for example, we've sort of gone through this a little bit in the previous subjects. So first of all, there's a Active Directory Administrator Center. If you remember, that was built on PowerShell, wasn't it? So that even though it's a graphical user interface, decision we make, every entry editing we make, every object we create, we can actually translate it into a PowerShell command and executes it. So Active Directory Administrator Center is a task-oriented based tool, which is based on Windows PowerShell. It's a new feature in 2012. Some of the things we can do in here and nowhere else is activate Active Directory Recycle Bin, configure fine-grained password policy, and look at the Active Directory, the PowerShell history viewer. Let me just quickly show you this. All right, so if this is my virtual machine with my server running, so I'm just quickly logging in. So we all know that, hopefully all know by now that most of our tools can be run
launch from this server manager in here, or we can click on Start and go to Administrative Tools and find most of our tools here. Okay, so personally, I just like to launch it from here. So if we look at Active Directory Administrative Center, like I said, this is a tool we can administer Active Directory with. It's based on PowerShell, and we can actually explore Active Directory. For example, we can create organizational units. We can go into it and look at what's inside. There's nothing inside of that one. Inside of 5ICW organizational unit, there's some user accounts, some computer accounts, and you can see with this one, this user is actually disabled. So I can actually enable this user. Oh, it does not have a password. So I'll just give it the default password, password 1, and then I'll enable this account. Okay, so we can do pretty much most of the things that we've been doing in Active Directory with this tool. The best thing is it's actually got a Active Directory, the PowerShell history viewer, which actually lets us see what what those actions I just did translated into what PowerShell commands. We can also go to We can also go to use this for fine-grained password policies. All right. So we can create so we haven't really talked about password policies in the previous subject, but later on when we cover group policies, we'll talk about the default password policy and how we can create a fine-grained password policy. All right, let's get back to our PowerPoint. There's also Ntdsutil command line tool. So NTDS, New Technology Directory Services Utilities. That's what basically it is. And it's a command-based tool. And from this, you can actually control the operation masters. In our practical today, in our labs, you'll be using this tool to change the operation masters, moving it from one domain controller to another domain controller. We can also perform some Active Directory database maintenance by performing offline defragmentation. We can also create snapshots. You're probably going, what? Snapshots? Didn't we just talk about snapshots? This is a different type of snapshot. This is a snapshot of your Active Directory. Just like we can have snapshots of virtual machines, we can take a snapshot of Active Directory, which is, again, a point-in-time backup of Active Directory. Okay? And when we do take a snapshot, it's stored separately to the normal running Active Directory. But if we want to actually if we want to look at the snapshot, we can actually expose this or mount it. Okay, what does that mean? That means we actually, the regular Active Directory is running on the default ports, whatever. We can then mount this alternative or this backup of Active Directory on a separate port. Okay, and we can still use our tools like Active Directory users and computers to go in and browse it and search for it and look for things, but it's not actually the running Active Directory. We can also use this tool to move the database files, and we can use this tool to maintain the domain controller metadata. We can also use it to reset the Active Directory directory service restore mode password. So if you remember, when we actually install Active Directory, we give it a restore mode password. But what if we forgot? We can use this tool to reset it. And there's plenty of modules that is related to PowerShell for Active Directory. We all know, and I've probably said it many times, anything you can do with your graphical user interface, you can do with PowerShell. And Active Directory is no different. Okay, so there's many modules for PowerShell for user management, computer management, group management, organizational unit management, password policy management, searching and modifying objects, forests and domain management, domain controller operation masters management. What's a managed service accounts management, site replication, central access claims management. So just be aware that anything you can do, there's a PowerShell option. Like I mentioned before, there's some things that you can do with PowerShell that you can't even do with a graphical user interface. There's some settings that if you want to have that setting turned on, you can't do it with the graphical user interface. You have to do it with the PowerShell. So in this subject, obviously, we're still learning. So we've given you a taste of PowerShell, but obviously we can't teach you everything in just PowerShell. It's too hard. So obviously, when you're first learning something, it's easier to learn with the graphical user interface tool. But once you're familiar with the graphical user interface tool, understand the different properties and settings of the whatever you're managing, then you learn the PowerShell part of it. Okay? So obviously, we'll give you a start with PowerShell, but sometimes it's up to you to progress with that. So if you actually want to get to a higher level in network administration, server administration, you'll need to learn how about automation, scripting, and in Server 2016 PowerShell. Okay. So let's talk about operation masters. Okay. So if you remember, we mentioned how even though we have multiple domain controllers in a domain, there's some tasks that only one should be the boss. Okay. I'll give the classic example. If you live at home, most of you are sort of probably living at home with your mum and dad. Yeah, you probably still have to ask your mum and dad if you're allowed to go out on Saturday nights or something. Maybe some of you do. Let's put it this way. If I was living at home and I asked my dad, can I go out on Saturday night? And he says, yes. But then, I talk to my mum and I tell her, hey, by the way, I'm going out on Saturday night. She goes, you're not allowed to go out on Saturday night. Who do I listen to? I'm a bit confused, aren't I? Who's the boss? Okay? In that situation, one's telling me yes, one's telling me no. Who's in charge? So basically, when we have operation masters, there's no confusion because there's only one domain controller which is saying it's in charge of this role. Okay, let's say at home, your mum's always in charge of allowing you to go out or not. Then you don't even need to ask your dad. You just need to ask your mum, right? There's no confusion. In Active Directory, with these operation masters, there's specific tasks that actually are only done by one domain controller. Okay, so some are forest-wide and some are domain-wide, which means, what does that mean? That means that you only need one of these for the whole forest, if they're forest-wide. And if they're domain-wide, that means you only need one of these for the whole domain. Okay, so for example, a forest-wide operation master is the domain naming master role. Basically, what does it do? It means that when you're about to create a new domain, the domain naming master role, you have to ask the domain naming master, am I allowed to use this name? It will say yes or no. Okay, basically it prevents anyone from creating a domain that's already using a name that's already been used. How confusing would that be? So if there's only one operation master that tells you yes or no to using that name, then there's no confusion. There's no chance of actually using the same name twice, is there? Okay. There's a schema master role. So if you remember, do you guys remember from last year how I described the schema? What's a schema? Maybe I wasn't. What I said wasn't actually memorable. Remember what I said? A schema is like a cookie cutter. Okay, remember that? No? All right, so basically a cookie cutter defines the shape of a cookie, doesn't it? The properties of a cookie. A schema is a plan, schematic, or scheme. Okay, it's all the objects in Active Directory has a definition, and the schema is where the definition is held. So if I want to create a new user object, go to the schema, I get a user object plan. And then you'll tell me that for a user, you'll need a name, you need a surname, you need a username, you need a password, you need this as optional, these are compulsory. So that's how I know that a user needs these properties. So I load it up from the schema. So the schema master is in charge of schema updates. Okay, so for example, by default, you have what's called a default schema. All the objects that you need, that's there by default. But what if you want to actually add Exchange Server? You guys are doing that through another subject, aren't you? You might want to install Exchange Server, but in order to use Exchange Server correctly or fully, you might need to have these other objects created in Active Directory. So you may have to do what's called extend the schema or update the schema. And when you do update the schema, you need to do it on the schema master. Okay? And then it will actually tell the others. Some domain operation master roles include the RID master. We just spoke about the RID. Okay, so we talk about how the RID is the relative ID. that is used to create the SIDs for objects in Active Directory. So obviously it's very important we don't get doubled up. It's very important that we don't conflict. So therefore we have a RID master which is in charge of all the RIDs. If you guys were all domain controllers and I was the RID master, I would say, hey, you get this pool of RIDs, okay, 1 to 1010. You get this other RID, 1011 to 2020, and so forth. So the RID master is in control of giving all the other domain controllers their pools of RID. And those domain controllers use those RIDs to create the user accounts, objects, everything that has a SID. When they use up their RIDs, they go back to RID master and get more. So there's also an infrastructure master role, a PDC emulator, and the PDC emulator role is actually an interesting one. It stands for primary domain controller. Okay, so back in the Windows NT days, Server NT, there used to be primary domain controllers and backup domain controllers. So basically, one of the jobs that the PDC emulator would do is that it will actually pretend or act as the primary domain controller for any NT servers that you still have, which are backup domain controllers. Okay, so that's probably not likely these days, but the other important function is that if you want to do a password change of a user, it is the PDC emulator is responsible for the password changes. So therefore, when you change a password, you have to contact the PDC emulator. And the reason for this is, what if people want to change their passwords from different locations? You might have a situation where the password is different. So when you have one server controlling it, that eliminates that chance. So managing Active Directory backup and recovery. So we spoke about this in the previous subject. So it's the system state or full backup of the domain controller also allows you to back up your Active Directory. We can do what's called non-authoritative restores, okay, which is normal restore, or we can do authoritative restores, which allows deleted objects to be returned onto the domain controllers. A full server restore typically is performed in the Windows recovery environment. Okay. Some tasks require that you stop the Active Directory domain services. Okay. It's like you can't change your engine if you're driving the car. You know what I mean? So you can't really back up or you can't really restore Active Directory fully if people are using Active Directory at this time. We can also use the Ntdsutil commands to optimize Active Directory domain services and clean up the metadata. Also use it to perform offline database defragmentation and remove records on deleted domain controllers. All right, so the Active Directory database, okay? Understanding the Active Directory database. The Active Directory domain services database holds all domain-based information on 4 partitions. Okay, so there's one database. There's actually 4 different partitions in it. There's a domain partition, okay, and that's where our Active Directory domain objects like user accounts and so forth are stored. You got the configuration partition. That's our configuration information. You got your schema partition, which we spoke about, where the schema is located, and then you have this application partition. So these 3 are actually required for Active Directory. This last one is not. Remember how I said Active Directory was a read optimized database? Okay, I said that right. It's a database, just like Access is a database. Okay, so this application partition is actually for us to use this Active Directory database as a database. You know how when we could, if we're smart enough, we could write a program, and like a program like just an app or something like that. And you know how sometimes you save information as part of the app. You could save that information back to the Active Directory database if you wanted to in this application partition, and that's what it's for. Okay, and the best thing about it is still read optimized. So therefore, any information you stored in there will be more efficient to read from than write to. So it's highly efficient for reading from. Okay, Active Directory domain services can be started or stopped using a service console. So it's a service. There's 3 states. There's actually Active Directory domain services started or stopped. So that's fairly easy to understand. There's also DSRM, which is the Directory Service recovery mode. Okay, so that's when you need to restore from backups. It is not possible to perform a system state restore when the Active Directory is in the stop state. Just because it's in the stop state, it can't restore it. It has to be in the DSRM state in order to restore it. That's why you have to boot into that recovery mode. We can create snapshots of the Active Directory database, like we mentioned, and we use the Ntdsutil as a tool to do that. We can mount this snapshot. So basically, we have the regular Active Directory running, but we can also mount this backup of Active Directory snapshot over here. Then we can expose the snapshot. So what does that mean? It means that Active Directory normally runs on a certain port, but if we actually mount this snapshot and we want to actually interact with it, we can actually expose it on a different port. Okay? So basically, if this normal Active Directory is still working and it's doing its job and people are interacting with it on the normal port, but on this other port, we're interacting with the snapshot of this Active Directory. Okay, to expose the snapshot, we can just use Active Directory users and computers and actually interact with this mounted snapshot. It's a read-only. You cannot directly restore from this snapshot, but you can actually go in and look at it. Look at what information is in that snapshot. And if you really want to recover an object, you can either do one or two ways. You can just see what's there and recreate it, or you can actually go in there and use the LDIF export import options to actually export out of this Active Directory and import it into your normal Active Directory. Okay. All right. So what about deleted objects? So traditionally in Active Directory, you have what's called this process. Okay. Deleted objects are removed through Tombstone. Recovered by Tombstone reanimation. So basically, you have live objects, you delete it, and there's a time period. Okay, if you don't do anything after that time period is expired, the garbage collector then permanently deletes it. But before that time period is exceeded, what you can do is actually do what's called a Tombstone reanimation, which basically, just like it sounds, you bring it back to life. Okay, so that's the traditional ways. You notice that there's not much of a, you either do it in time or you lose it. So the new way is that Active Directory recycle bin, and we looked at this in the previous subject, and it's just like it sounds. Okay, we all know what a recycle bin is on the file system. You delete something, it goes to recycle bin before it's permanently deleted. And if you made a mistake, you go to recycle bin and you restore it. And it's easy as that. And Active Directory recycle bin adds that same functionality, but to Active Directory. And it's very useful. Okay, how many times have you accidentally clicked on the wrong thing and deleted it? Okay, or accidentally thought you were selecting something else and press delete and actually delete something else. I've done that many a times in the file system, but I'm sure it'll happen in the Active Directory as well. So the Active Directory recycle bin provides a way to restore deleted objects without any Active Directory downtime. You don't have to turn it off at all. Unlike a restore from the backup, like we said before, where you had to go into that recovery mode or restore mode, it's still running. It's up and running. We just go to recycle bin and undelete it. So now the process is you're live, you delete it, it's deleted, it's in the recycle bin. And when the recycle bin gets to full or the deleted object lifetime is expired, then it's actually recycled and gets physically deleted. So it adds this extra time here, and then you can actually restore it back to life. All right, guys, so that's the end of the PowerPoint. So what I want you to do now is to work on your second worksheet. So in this worksheet, you'll be working with operation masters. You'll be transferring operation masters. You'll be actually creating and installing a read-only domain controller and so forth. So work on that, and if you need help, contact me.